in the room. So our next speaker is a guy that many of you know. And one of the things that I always really love about Charles is how he is able to go think about things in a variety of different ways. He's been to MacTech Conference many times. He's spoken at a variety of MacTech events. He has a long track record of looking out in the future and seeing some of the opportunities and stuff that are there, and more importantly, how to go about building them. Because as Charles has said to me in the past, and has even said so recently, there's lots of good ideas in the world, but then being able to build them is a whole other picture of it. He's also known, I did not, can I say what you just, okay. So apparently last year at MacTech Conference, he was at MacTech Conference and saw a presenter and then decided, we should buy that company. So they bought the company on it, and apparently the deal started at MacTech Conference in one form or another. So with that, Charles Edge is heading up R&D and, what was the other one? Stuff. And oh yeah, R&D and acquisitions, that's the stuff. I'm not gonna let you off the hook on this. At Jamf, he's a great resource. If you haven't met him, go up and meet him. Check him out, although he's only gonna be here today. He's taking off in here soon for it. But how about a very warm welcome for Charles Edge. All righty. You good?
Thanks, Neil.
You got a mic? Yeah, there you go.
You can go. So I'm really sorry to bring you all inside. If I had my preference, we'd be outside barefoot on the sand, kind of banging this thing out, but that's not really much of an option, I guess. Maybe next year. Yeah. So I like to start books, articles, presentations with an outline. Define your audience, think about what your audience wants to get out of it, and then write an outline to try to tell a story narrative to take them on the journey with you there. You can see proof that there's an outline by the sidebar in Keynote that shows my slides. I thought I needed to include proof that I was being deliberate. There's often doubt about that. So in this talk, we're going to go through the chapters of my next book that'll be out in a couple months, not because I want you all to buy the book. I felt like I needed to preface this talk with that fact. If you all bought the book, it wouldn't buy my plane ticket to come out here, so it's not a sales pitch for the book. It's more, when you sit down to write and you're trying to be really diligent, you're really trying to take your thoughts and put them into an orderly fashion. And when I wrote the book, I was really hoping to look at the future more than the past. So I'm going to skip chapter 1 for a bit and come back to it. Chapter 2 in the book is about agent-based management. Having been involved in writing or editing a couple of agents, that seemed like a pretty solid place to start, and it's kind of becoming a legacy technology. And we have Greg here. Greg, raise your hand. A big applause for Greg. You can't clap enough for Greg. So he wrote Monkey. That's an agent. Any script, any binary that we write is easily converted into an agent of some sort. Persistent software that runs on the machine that does something. It seems pretty simple. It can be used for command and control and a number of other things. I hear a lot of people call MDM agentless technology, but MDM client is an agent. It runs, it does some things, it does almost the exact same things that a number of other agents do. It just does so in a multi-vendor supported way. Chapter 3, we're looking at profiles. This is kind of, I would say at this point, a known thing. Almost everyone in the room probably knows how to make a profile, has probably installed profiles. It's old hat, but yet it's stuff that we have to do every day practically. So I'm not surprised that there aren't any talks here on how to do that. Chapter 4 of the book, MDM internals. And here we're getting into the nitty-gritty on a code line-by-line level of what MDM does, what binaries or agents that it's calling, and how it's processing things like store D requests and things of that nature. Chapters 5, uh-oh. I'll keep my hand away from the mic, sorry. Chapters 5 and 6, we get into provisioning, device provisioning. I had initially intended for the whole book, each chapter, to be merging the concepts of iOS and macOS together in one to show a complete story and a unified story. Provisioning is a place where there's a divergent story, and I couldn't really do that. So we split those in two, chapter 5, chapter 6, and chapter 5, we got into Mac provisioning. And a lot of that chapter was devoted to Mac Deploy Stick and kind of taking a look at what Tim had built there. Phil and Ben are going to take us through that in this conference, so I don't need to go into too much detail there, but I can say, love Mac Deploy Stick. And even more than loving Mac Deploy Stick, I love some of the techniques that he used and some of the ways that he thought outside of the box. As an example, spinning up an MDM with micro MDM in order to not have to do a few things like clicking on boxes. And then in chapter 6, we can't forget in provisioning about iOS. We definitely talk a lot about Apple Configurator. Sal's going to talk about APU, but in the book I would say we talked a lot more, because it's publicly available, about AEiOS and a few open source products that really bolt additional programmatic concepts on top. Chapter 7, Endpoint Encryption. This wasn't actually intended to be a standalone chapter, but my co-author on the book was Rich Troughton. Has anyone seen Rich Troughton give a talk before? And is it surprising in any way that he would take what was supposed to be like a 3 or 4 page section on File Vault and turn it into a whole chapter? It turned out great. It's one of the best chapters I've ever had the pleasure of working on. You know, APFS, File Vault, it's still a thing. We're not quite done with the transition yet. And Tim's going to take us through some of that. And so hopefully you're seeing a trend here of a lot of the coverage that I was looking at being mirrored by what Neil's kind of constructed in this conference. Chapter 8, getting into the app distribution build train, what I called it. And here we're looking at both package and IPA creation programmatically in a repeatable fashion. And this starts, I think, the conversation with auto package and creating recipes and auto packager. And I take it a bit further and start getting into automated regression analysis and things of that nature. And then chapter 9, securing your fleet. Security, I guess, is a thing, supposedly. So Ed, one of the people I respect most in this community, has moved into security research, and will share some of his story around that at the conference. But most of these practices that we implement at our customers and or employers are kind of a result of a lot of this research that's done. And a lot of features that are built are based on closing out some of those vulnerabilities. And when I think about how important that research is, I would definitely rather Ed find something than someone else. And then, of course, security continues. A lot of the sessions, I would say some of my favorite content at MacTech and any conference that I visited last year was really kind of taking a look at different aspects of the security of our platforms. And then, if you find something, what do you do with it? Getting into kind of the incident response side with Thomas, who's sitting up front. Look, you're on the screen. Yay. And to me, this really goes into gathering telemetry on what's happening on these devices and how can we best keep people safe based on watching those patterns and what's unfolding. And then, of course, there's, if you if you actually think you're under attack, what do you do then? The one thing I would say here as a caveat is, after speaking at Black Hat and DEF CON and being involved in the security world for a while, we have to be careful not to overdo our response. No one likes it when you run in the room screaming and crying or freaking them out, or talking about how there's all these vulnerabilities and reducing trust in the operating system that we're here to shepherd that trust of. And then, of course, Apple keeps moving the cheese. So there's all these new security policies that Apple keeps implementing, and how are we going to react to those as a community? I don't think we have much of a choice in how we react to them. It's pretty much well defined that this is the way this is going to work, but we can certainly talk about it and try to be as proactive as possible. And then in chapter 10, we get into continuous testing. There's definitely a concept in software engineering: continuous delivery, continuous testing, continuous research. Just take continuous, put another word at the end, and you're good. But here, a lot of what we were going through is scripting. So the move from ZSH, or from Bash to ZSH, as an example of some of the scripting, but also getting into a little bit of debugging. And this, I'm really bummed I won't be here, but I'm happy, I can't wait to watch it after I get home. But kind of getting into the REST side of things. The world is just a connection of interconnected API endpoints at this point. And so kind of anytime I think of something new that we might want to build at Jamf, I immediately start looking for what is available that I can consume in REST, and then how can I enrich that and add some logic to it. And I use a tool called Postman. I don't know, I haven't read Alex's session description or session itself, but I use a tool called Postman a lot for that. So just a random side note, it's awesome. Directory services. Does anyone want to talk about Open Directory today? But 96% of customers that I talk to still need it and use it. And by the way, if you use an IDP or an identity provider, they're using, probably on the back end, they're connecting to your existing directory service in order to process users and groups and things of that nature. So they're not going anywhere. I look forward to the day when I'm writing a book and I don't have to talk about these things anymore, but it's still there. And to prove it's still there, Apple even built even more stuff into the operating system. And we had hoped that we could shut down the Nomad project, that Apple would do it all, but we're not quite there yet. So customizing the user experience, chapter 12, kind of digging into taking some of these UX research concepts and self-service type of interfaces, apps, and really trying to make the best experience for people who, if you think about it, on day zero, just day one, need to do their job and don't need all the cruft of clicking on boxes and listening to us drone on. And Naveen talked about that today. So the one thing I can say here, if we're talking about the future, and right now I'm kind of going through the present and the near-term future, but if we're talking about the future, I see UX research as an exploding industry that that us as people who have spent so much time trying to craft these great experiences on devices that we give people could probably either take a lot from or enrich by joining that industry. Not that I don't want you to show up at MacTech anymore. So chapter 13, identity and device trust. When I think about the next 2 to 3 years, I think a lot about identity and device trust. Who in the room uses a federated identity provider like Okta OneLogin or Azure Active Directory? Who's really tired because they ate too much and they're not raising their hand just because of that? Let's try that again. Who's using a federated IDP? So a little less than half of the room. So the other half of you, if you have one takeaway from this talk, I would say it is talk to Ed about the stuff they're doing at Duo, talk to anyone that you can find about how they're using Okta OneLogin, Azure Active Directory or Ping Identity or one of the other big OAuth or SAML providers. Chapter 14. Now we're getting into what I'm really here to talk about, the future, right? Does anyone want to talk about the future? Dang it, I thought I could go home. But first, I'm just going to tease you and tell you a little bit about the past. So I gave a talk a couple weeks ago at MacSysAdmin in Sweden, and I'm going to show a few of the slides from that talk. And I followed chapter 1 of the book, which I had initially meant to be like a 10-page chapter. And I had this thesis attached to it, that Apple was innovating and rapidly innovating IT, and that we were moving into a new era. But when I really started digging into what we're doing versus what we were doing 10, 20, 30 years ago, I ended up disproving my own thesis and having to pivot. And as a result, the chapter ended up becoming almost 60 pages, taking me about a month over schedule, which Adam loves when authors do that. Although you don't care anymore, do you? No. So I'll start this part by talking about cycles. So the Apple I and the Apple II, reaching back into before I was even born, these were hacker computers. They were fully open operating systems. In fact, the specs of the devices were published, and anyone could build it if they knew how to wrap the wires properly and stuff like that. And then along came the Mac, and all these hackers who had been attracted to Apple, like Andy Hertzfeld, they actually built a closed operating system. I don't think it was intentional to close the operating system. It was more just they wanted to ship something really cool, and the quickest way to do it was not to give a lot of options for people to hack that. And then came OS X. And OS X was a fully open operating system, so open that the microkernel was brought over with Avi from Carnegie Mellon a long time ago. So we go through these ebbs and flows. iOS comes out, another closed operating system, the rebrand to Mac OS, which under the hood is really getting into, yet again, a much more closed operating system. It seems today to be kind of a mix, but it's not trending to stay that way. And that's not bad. It is just what it is. So here's a question. I've heard 3 people so far at this conference say that with this annual release cycle, it's really hard to keep up with what Apple's doing. Fair? Yeah. So has Apple been releasing more operating systems more frequently than ever in the past few years? So in the past 35 years, we've gotten 25 operating systems. That's a little less than 1.5 per year. But I don't think that actually tells the story. There was a very dark time in Apple history. And we only got 3 operating systems. One of those sat on the market for 6 years, which isn't exactly fair because you could argue like 6.7 was its own operating system, but stay with me for a minute. So if you take that out, then we drop closer to 1 per year. We're at 1.18 operating systems per year. So I would say that when the platform was growing in its adoption, we did go through a phase where we got 1 every other year, and I think that was the easiest for enterprises to handle. But other than that phase, we've definitely stayed on a nice, consistent track of almost 1 a year. And so, since we're talking about the future, let's first talk about 1988. In 1988, we got System 6. It was the 5th operating system, or 6th operating system in 5 years. It was a very rapid time of innovation. Another word for innovation is tech debt. So as we were rapidly writing this code, we were rapidly creating more problems for ourselves in the next operating systems. And the reason that I start with System 6 is we got this weird thing called desk accessories. It turned out people wanted to interoperate between apps that were running on the Mac. Crazy concept. So Apple gave us desk accessories. things like scrapbooks, things like control panels. By the way, the trash emptied every time you rebooted. I think we should bring that feature back. I've seen way too many people use the trash can as a storage location. So, what is this thing? Did this go away, or do we still have it? So the chooser, this is how we access network resources. If you take into account what we really cared about in the chooser, it was mostly these things. It was accessing filers and accessing network printers. Network printers, we've come into an era where we configure those with the printer system preference pane. And filers, we connect to using the connect to server dialog. So this is a very simple example of the evolution of these early concepts that were brought to us from the likes of Andy Hertzfeld, et cetera, and moving them into the modern era. Now, the back-end technology has completely changed for all these things. We're using objective-oriented programming. These are mostly calling Objective-C libraries or Swift libraries. But the concepts and the GUI buttons are often still the same. Did anyone ever use this tool? So they had this crazy concept. You do these things with the mouse and hitting keys, and maybe you want to record those things, and you want to then replay those events. So we could make macros. And this was an era of cassettes, and I like to think of someone like an Andy Hertzfeld sitting there listening to Huey Lewis while writing this, watching the cassette move and being like, "Oh, dude!" So, but that record button is part of Apple's DNA when it comes to automation. If we flash forward, today we have AppleScript editor, temporarily at least. And in AppleScript, that record button still lives. It turned out that people didn't want to complete the same events over and over. They just wanted to write a script to do the events for them. And if we flash forward even further, we get Automator, which also still gives us this pretty little record button. And a cute robot. Who likes the Automator robot icon? Who named Otto the Automator? Sal. And Sal, who insisted that we anthropomorphize the Automator with its icon?
That was SJ.
So, directly from Steve Jobs. Thank you. So then, at this era, we're also getting the ability to manage these weird desk accessories. Not everyone wants them. They take up memory. We can disable them and improve performance in other areas of the system if we don't need them. This would later evolve into another tool that we'll get to in a few slides. So we flash forward to 1991. We get, amongst other things, the Big Bang. This was OS 7. I'm sure some of you in the room remember when this came out. I do. Oddly enough. And this was built by a horrible team of humans called the Blue Meanies. And this began the move to 32-bit, and it brought with it AppleScript and this weird folder in your system folder called extensions. Now, early Mac troubleshooting, I used to love this because it was the simplest process ever. You would take these extensions and you would drag them to the desktop, and you'd reboot, and your computer would magically work again. It turns out that invading the kernel space, which is what an extension is doing, is a bit buggy sometimes, because we don't have, a lot of times as third-party software developers, the same rigor that Apple might have, which, by the way, also comes and goes in waves. So you can manage these. If you could actually boot OS 7 through 9, you can manage these with this great little tool called the Extensions Manager. Just check a box and you enable the extension. And we also at this era got the first early device management tools. This was the first time that we actually set up a socket and logged into another machine and took action and made that machine do something different. And this was right around the time that I was starting at the University of Georgia managing labs. Kurt Cobain was still alive. It was a long time ago. So we could configure computers to do things that we wanted. We could restrict what computers were able to do. The word restriction wasn't yet a bad thing, and this is really important. We could restrict the Finder to operate in a very specific way. We also got the ability to store home folders on network volumes that were run by Apple Share IP servers, and we got the eMate for Classroom. And that became Apple's story for education that took them years into the future. And it was a totally weird concept. I could do my homework on a mobile device, and then I could turn my homework in. Like, I never would have thought that that was possible. So the restricted Finder. Who wants to work in an environment like this called the restricted Finder? Show of hands. So I want to point out that the restricted Finder is now called iOS. Everything. So it turns out that maybe it's not that bad not to have all the features that we might want and think that we need. So at ease for workgroups, at its core, by default, you would run with a restricted Finder. The screenshot that I showed had panels as opposed to just a restricted Finder. And it was this crazy idea. You could like disable certain parts of the operating system, like intentionally neutering what the system was doing. You could control access to the chooser and these weird desk accessories. Much like today, we're controlling access via TCC to various parts of the operating system and through texts. And then you could deploy, I wouldn't say deploy apps, but you could control what apps users see. You could say, oh, well, that classroom doesn't need this set of apps, so I'm going to limit what they can see. Now, does this interface look modern to anyone? It probably should. So if we take the icons, what are these little buttons on the screen doing? What is the remote doing? There. So we are configuring members and groups. We're configuring what programs, later called applications, later called apps, are on the devices. We're configuring what settings are on the device. We're configuring the content in some cases that we're putting on the device. And then we're giving ourselves a little bit of information about that program. Now, these, if we were to take that design, remove 8-bit, make it flat, and then rearrange the icons in a way that makes a little more sense, then it might look like this. And this is a tool called Profile Manager. At ease for workgroups begat a tool called Macintosh Manager, which begat a tool called Workgroup Manager, which begat a tool called Profile Manager. Under the hood, a lot of things changed. We're using property lists now, whereas we were using DAT files then. We're streaming over push notifications. We're doing a lot of things differently under the hood. And we got away from the ethos for a little while, but then we put the user back at the center of the design at some point. We simplified it, and now we're back to where we were in 1988. And not just in the device management side, but also other things. So eMate Classroom, like I said, crazy idea, mobile device, I'm going to put content back on a server. And what that looked like was I would plug in the device, and then I would have this handy-dandy little thing called hand-in. That way my students knew exactly what to put where. That hand-in pane evolved over time. And today, we have something very similar called a share sheet in iOS. And that becomes the kind of fundamental building block of Apple Schoolwork. So these are evolutions. They're way prettier, but I would say that the design itself is very symbolic of kind of where we came from. So what really changed? I mentioned under the hood, we got property lists, we got all these other things, but those are a reaction to what was happening in the world around us. And what was happening in the world around us was a number of things, the advent of the internet, and when you get mobility, all of a sudden we have to transition into a more push-oriented model. We can't open a Unix socket into another device for a number of reasons. A, we can't see the device because it's natted behind some other firewall probably, like a student at home or one of our coworkers at home. But also it's just incredibly insecure to do that. In 1988, people weren't using Wireshark to listen to traffic and pulling passwords out of the air. I still remember my first time going to DEF CON, and I saw on the wall of sheep my buddy's name, my name, with the password right there in raw text. I had no idea that was possible yet. So the world has evolved and taken away our ability to operate in these little walled gardens, for better or worse. And then tethering, we didn't want to do anymore. Everything's now encrypted. And I would say, getting back to this concept of microservices, the world became very object-oriented in a very distributed or de-distributed way. So we had to react to that. And really, that's what mobility means to me in a lot of ways. We also, as we became a global internet-connected platform, we also had a lot of things happening. We didn't keep credit cards on computers in 1988. In fact, a lot of people didn't have credit cards yet. There was no such thing as e-commerce yet, really. The internet hadn't happened. Tim Berners-Lee wouldn't write that, or write HTTP at least, for 3 more years. And so as you interconnect all these people, you start realizing that not everyone has the same ethos that you do. And not everyone is equal. Some people want some of what you have, for better or worse. So you get these bad actors, or what we think of as bad actors today. And then the rise of nation-state hacking, very, very advanced stuff. So we had to react to these factors and lots and lots and lots of other factors. And the ecosystem that surrounds the platform also had to start reacting to these factors. This was supposed to say the Apple II. The Apple II was a hacker's computer. And that's to say that the first computer millionaires really started springing up. And a lot of these people would write games in assembly or write tools like VisiCalc, AmiPro. And it was a very attractive platform because it was exploding, and a lot of people started writing software for it. And that ecosystem is alive and thriving today and on a lot of different levels, which you can see through the App Store and a lot of other places. And that ecosystem includes not only what's on the computer, but also the environment the computer lives in. So we'll hear at the conference about Wi-Fi. We'll hear about business automation. And I can say on the business automation front, any consultants in the room, when I went out to do break fix as a young consultant and help my customers, they were thankful and they paid me, usually. Not often, actually. That's probably why I don't do it anymore. But they paid me to do that. When I helped them solve real business problems and automate their business, they became customers for life. A lot of them were customers when I sold out 10 years later. What does the ecosystem not include? Did anyone ever use AppleShare IP? Anyone run a mail server on a Quadra? Those were open relays. You wouldn't think of doing that today. I mean, you might do it, but it wouldn't last for more than 10 minutes. So Apple has always had a server platform, and the number of services that platform RAN grew over time, and then we saw a very rapid decline towards the end of its life. It's still distributed, of course, but Profile Manager is considered by many to be more of a reference implementation for MDM rather than its own kind of standalone server. And as a result of this, a lot of people need big files on their LAN. So we're going to hear from Dave about integrating NAS, which isn't just about file sharing. You know, a Buffalo or a Synology can definitely run a lot more services, but in the wake that the Mac server has left, we get other options in that ecosystem. And we'll hear about troubleshooting, which, by the way, good, deliberate, methodical troubleshooting is quite possibly the best skill that anyone in the room can have. So the more we hear about other techniques, other options, the better we always are. We'll hear about telecom and VoIP and how that's matured for the platform. And then I would say the last 6 months, I have been almost singularly focused on machine learning and AI. And so I'm very interested to hear this session, even though I won't be here. I'll have to watch it later. But I used to think that, I still think that blockchain is a buzzword, but I used to think that machine learning was a buzzword as well until I actually started writing meaningful code that could do things. And that very much changed my outlook there. So chapter 14, finally we're getting into what I said I'd do in this talk. We've got 15 minutes to go. Is it still 15 minutes? Sure, why not? So the future of Apple device management. So will privacy become less of a thing? I don't think so. I have a feeling that with the massive amounts of regulation happening right now, that it's just going to become more of a thing. And what does that really mean tactically? Like how are we going to be impacted by that with how we manage and use these devices? And definitely I would say that we will have more privacy controls. The complaining that we're doing now is nothing compared to what we will be doing later. I would say things like dilibs. With dilib hacking, that is just probably going to go away. Any software that's leveraging that type of technology is probably going to be hurting in a bit. And then more supervision-esque options. And what does supervision, if we're talking about a multi-platform Apple, mean? It means supervision for the Mac, which hasn't necessarily shipped yet, and supervision for iOS. But even more, it means when we DEP or automated enroll a device, then we have additional options for how we're going to manage those devices, which makes MDM an even more critical aspect of managing Apple devices than it's ever been. And then we get, I would say, over time, less non-supervision automation. So if anyone thinks that you'll be able to register a launch daemon with launch services in 5 to 10 years without some kind of MDM approving that hash or domain space ahead of time, I very much would not think that that's going to be an option in the long-term future, maybe in the near term. But if we look at what we've already been restricted from, and then just kind of project that forward. And then less special cases. This is a really easy one. A lot of vendors, including where I work, got a free pass for some things as Apple was rapidly innovating, and I think that's just going to go to the wayside. I don't think anybody will get a special pass anymore from Apple. So if we're looking at the future, you know, if privacy is going to continue to become more of a thing, will devices become less mobile? I mean, 5G, that's going to make devices less mobile, right? So when we think about mobility and we project out, I've mentioned a couple of times the world is really just becoming a collection of interconnected REST endpoints that are triggered from webhooks, basically. And that's definitely going to continue. And Whether you're already using integrations like that or you're planning on it, there are tools out there like Zapier, IFTTT, where you can build these automations and you can string together workflows. As an example, when I enroll a device into my MDM instance, my lights in my house flash. This is something everyone should probably do. And a lot of this is gated and secured by technology like JWT's OAuth, SAML. So getting back to the federated identity provider, you are using web services, we are all using web services, and being able to connect those and gate those is kind of important. Packages, this is a very small technical one. I just think they're going to go away pretty soonish. Of course, I said that on stage at a conference 4 years ago, and they're still not gone, but that just makes me want to double down on my prediction. So signing, and I would go further than signing is going to be pretty much on everything and say that we're getting into a state where signing and pinning is. And that can confound security administrators at company who want that telemetry to be able to say, I know everything that you're doing and what is being communicated outside our walls, but at the same time, certificates pinned, expiring in shorter intervals, easily revoked, things of that nature. And then apps. We said business automation, but what does that really mean? A lot of times that means apps. And if you can write an app on an iPad, then you need the Mac even less than you needed it before. And the evolution of those apps, we used to call them programs. That's when we wrote them in assembly and Pascal and BASIC. And then we moved on to Swift Playgrounds. I was able to teach my daughter Swift with Swift Playgrounds, and then we were able to, build a real Swift app together. And we didn't have to build a backend. We were able to just import an Amazon SDK and use Amazon's backend as a service. So that whole industry, cottage industry that had built itself around SQL clusters and made this whole app development thing more complicated than it needed to be is kind of gone. It's now just a little REST call. Machine learning is even available that way. Using SageMaker or some other service, I can pop over some hashes and it can return back some predictions, which is pretty cool. Especially if you have a PhD around who can actually interpret what it's telling you. And then app development as a service. If you don't want to write the stuff, you just have somebody else write it. But the days of having to go out and buy like a $10 million implementation of JDS Uniphase just to do some super basic supply chain management are way behind us. And when I think digging into that stuff about the privacy, the controls, identity and device trust. So the more people that use an Okta or a Ping or a One Login, the more I think we understand that it's pretty great not to have to enter passwords, not to have to reset passwords. And these services used to be hosted in our environments, but now they're all hosted spread around the web. And we need to deprovision those services from users all at once, or provision them for users all at once. And in an object-oriented fashion. And then in addition, we can then take action based on the combination of factors that we know about that user. We know what device they're on. We know the security posture and whether their device meets our security posture, potentially. And we know their identity. And the lowest common denominator of those factors can allow us to control what that user's then able to access. We don't want some of our data to be accessible by our coworkers when they're at Starbucks on a multi-tenant device potentially, or one that we don't own. And that regrettably right now means that we need a lot of additional agents, but hopefully that won't last for too much longer. And we can then have much more trust and allow much more of our assets to leave our environment. And a lot of that is, I would say, tactically learning the basics of SAML, OAuth brokers. I did in this book go through about 40 pages of the history and the building blocks of OAuth and SAML and how all of this kind of came to be. It's a very dry read. Most of it's in XML, sorry. And then the last thing I would say, which is basically what was told to those Apple II hackers all those years ago, is to rethink everything. If the MIT students who brought us interactive computing hadn't have rethought batch process punch card computing, we would not be where we are today because no one would be interested in this stuff. So it is on us as the torchbearers of the next generation to kind of take all of our assumptions and rethink them and challenge them. And to me, that's always been what hacking around at this stuff is about. So, or do.
What questions do we have for Charles? I'll call on somebody randomly. Don't think I won't do it. There we go. We got a winner.
Oh, when is my book available? That is a very good question. I don't know. Sorry? Amazon says December 30th. Amazon, like a month ago, said May or March of next year. I'm constantly amazed, with the exception of the angsts, how long it takes to get books out there. I do understand there's a truckload of wet paper and they have to print it and all that. But when the book is done, it feels like the digital copy should be available immediately. Because it could be. So December 30th, according to Amazon. Usually I get my author copies where I've seen the first tweet that someone got their copy. So and that's been true across all publishers with the exception of one that I've ever worked with. And he's there. Yes, sir.
That was really interesting to see the release cycle of different Mac OSs over the years and Apple OSs. But one of the things that has changed is I feel like Apple has made it harder and harder. I feel like Apple has made it harder.
Right.
And now Catalina comes out and we're already seeing end users applying it or trying to. So I guess the question is, what do you think that looks like going forward? How is that, get it day one, day zero, whatever?
I mean, so to repeat the question, we don't have the choice to update the OS. Used to, you had to buy it and you had to get disks. And I would say those first few operating systems you actually didn't have to buy. In fact, Apple ran ads in magazines saying that you'll never have to buy Apple software. And then we did, of course, when Pepsi salesmen showed up. But I would say the classic. There's an MDM deferral option. So if devices are enrolled in an MDM, then we can defer for X number of days. That I think max integer field is 90.
90, yeah.
So we can't delay an OS from going out past 90. We can use something like Google Santa, like what he was talking about, to kind of restrict the installer from Mac to run, but that doesn't include iOS. So do I think anything's going to change?
Yeah, is it going to get better, worse? How's that needle going to tip?
I think it's going to get worse.
Yeah, I agree.
If you think that deploying an OS faster is quote unquote worse. And Catalina is probably a good example of why you might want to defer.
I feel like people say that about every release.
I think some of us become less patient with every release, but
Sure.
it's not like it's ever been any different.
Yeah.
With any operating system, whether it's Microsoft, Apple, any version of Linux, it's always been the same.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
Oh,
Where are we? Right here.
On agents for me,
sure.
what do you perceive to be the best replacement for any agent?
I mean, so the way we're going is where an app registers an extension, and that will be the replacement of the agent framework. at some point in the future. So as an example, if you want to, as the Malwarebytes case, if you want to terminate a process, like sig up a process, you need to interface with the kernel to do something at that low a level. In the future, Apple's not going to allow us to do that. Kexts are going to go away, and therefore we will have to interface with that through a known API that Apple makes available to us. And what we're going to have to do is put all of that into an app and rely on the API endpoints that Apple makes available. So those of us who write software right now, hammering Apple to enrich different endpoints to give us stuff that helps us get away from running those binaries, agents, apps on the device. But if you look at the network extension or the new threat protection extension in the Mac, then I think you see a clear story of where we're going with that. And they already did it with virtualization software. Now we're getting into doing it with other types of software. But the future is going to be an app loads, it registers something, and now as an example of what I can do with a network extension that I would have had to do with a firewall or a kernel extension before would be like a Little Snitch. Little Snitch is going to have to completely refactor the entire code base, because firing up a kernel extension and telling you when something's accessing a port is not going to be allowed anymore. Instead, I can say, watch the TCP stack, and every time a socket's open, interface, do something. Run some code, and that's going to be the future. And as far as management agents, like where I work, and any other agent out there, we're going to have to respond to whatever Apple's throwing at us as well. I mean, conflict catcher. Yeah, if you think that the TCC entries in system preference pane don't look a lot like extensions manager, I think that's where we're going with extensions is, oh, I registered a network extension, now that's going to show up in some kind of interface. I very much hope they call it extensions manager, but I doubt they will. Because whoever's writing that code today is way smarter than the person writing that code 30 years ago in their head. No offense to any of them, or us. We all do it. You can just yell it out. I'll repeat it so it's on video.
Do you think it'll be before a major MDM vendor is compromised?
Oh, so the question is, how long do I think before a major MDM vendor is compromised? I can say at day job, whatever my day job might be. We run red and blue team drills to hopefully keep that from happening, but it is just a matter of time. The world is just a collection of REST endpoints, and the beauty of functional code. Anyone who went to college in the 90s and learned or before and learned how to write code, the beauty of functional coding is it was very easy to track and to write and to be holistic. The challenge with object-oriented programming is there are a potential of 800 files or classes that there are things happening. And so it's almost impossible to keep security vulnerabilities from happening. And that's just life now. Also, back then, people didn't use passwords mostly. So there's that. Like OS 9 didn't even, it kind of did, but not really.
What was your favorite? Oh.
So to repeat the question for the sake of the video listeners, what was my favorite OS that was called 10.6.5 as the first question? And I would say, yeah, Snow Leopard, that era of operating systems. It wasn't my specific favorite. I don't know that I could pick one of those, but I would say the 10.6, 10.7, that era of operating systems would definitely be my favorite. The most fun, though, was probably 10.1 to 10.3. And we were going through a lot of rapid change, so it was frustrating equally to how some of the privacy controls have been frustrating recently for people who are charged with managing lots and lots of devices. But it was really fun to do all that reverse engineering work. And I would say that some of my more recent decisions for what to do with my own career were based on looking back on that time fondly. So, and then there was the second half of that question? What are my thoughts on Catalina? I will not say that on recorded video. No.
Sitting on the microphone.
I think Catalina's fine. I would say the more people that can make feature requests to get a digest form of accepting all the TCC controls, the better. I don't need 9 dialog boxes. I need 1. And like OAuth handles this with a grant type. I need a grant type for TCC, not 9 boxes to click on. I think it's an okay move to make. I don't mind it, but I would like it to be simpler and cleaner. All right, there's another speaker waiting, so I'll let them get up. Thank you all so much.